What really happened to One Piece's art style? If you talk about the manga before and after the time skip, people usually say the art got better, but this is also the same One Piece with paneling like this, as well as chapters that come out looking like this. And yet, you can't help but look at the newer arcs of One Piece and admit that they have some of the manga's best looking art, whether it's the colorful cover pages, unique character designs, or expressive fight scenes. Which raises the question, how does One Piece's current art style compare to the older look, and which one is really better? To answer this, I've come up with 3 things I think the current art style does better, and 2 things that I think hurt its potential. And before I start, it should go without saying that this video will probably include some spoilers. Now, in my previous video where I focused on everything up through the Paramount War, I broke things up into clear stages. But at this point, One Piece has kind of looked largely the same from that point up to about Whole Cake Island. So rather than try and make up neat stages that aren't there, I'm just gonna dive right into what the current art style does better and worse. And because I love One Piece so much, we'll start with what I like. First of all, one thing I think Oda has really improved on is the color scheme of the manga. You look at the original volume covers and they're definitely colorful, lots of reds and blues, and pretty saturated. But it's got this sort of, I guess, watercolor look, so to speak, where the colors seemed somewhat faded. In contrast, the stuff after Fishman Island, and even some of the Fishman Island stuff, is just so much more colorful. To be honest, it's not like the style even changes all that much. I mean, you have to look really hard to see any stylistic changes as far as how Oda colored back then versus how he colors now. He still does this watercolor sort of look. The only real difference is that he uses brighter colors more often. When you look at anything prior to, say, Paramount War, it's generally less saturated, but then you look at the stuff later in the manga and it's got lots of bright colors. For the sake of comparison, let's look at the Chapter 100 color spread versus the one for Chapter 1000. Chapter 100 is very much representative of what I said before. It's got a lot of warm colors, lots of yellows and oranges, but it also has that like pastel watercolor scheme to it. Now, Chapter 1000 has generally the same color scheme, but a lot of the colors are much brighter, specifically the yellows. By contrast, it's clearly much more saturated and as a result, feels a lot more colorful even though the style is basically the same. And it's these brighter colors that define a lot of the newer color pages. Granted, this isn't always the case. It's not uncommon to see drawings like this cover of Luffy and Katakuri where the colors don't seem that different from a pastel color scheme. But even in a case like this, it still seems more colorful. If you compare it to this color page from pre-time skip, the color schemes don't even seem that different. But when you compare the characters, the ones in the volume cover have a bunch of colors that are used to make them look more detailed. And that's pretty common too in a lot of the newer stuff. Increased detail, but not just in the colors. You can also see this in the line work. Actually, before I say more on that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, I said in my other video how much I love the older style because of the bold line work. By the time you get to the newer stuff, it's still relatively bold, but it's not as clearly defined. It's somewhat gritty or messy. And part of me definitely does not like this change, and I'll explain why that is when we get to my dislikes in a few minutes. But the more I really compare the newer and older stuff, the more I realize how One Piece has actually gotten more detailed. I can't remember where I read it, but there's a quote from Oda where he explains that he liked to draw more realistic art when he was younger, but nobody seemed to like it, so he stuck to the simpler stuff. At the same time, you also have quotes like when he says he prefers the older days of manga when everything was more cartoonish. So it's always been interesting to see how Oda balances realism and stylization. Before, it was clearly more stylized. Now, it's really 50-50. On the one hand, the thinner line work can seem somewhat sketchier, But on the other hand, this also allows for more expression. For example, one of the best comparisons you can make is the original spread of Luffy punching Bellamy, and then when it happens again in Dressrosa. At first glance, they almost seem identical in terms of style. They each do this thing where instead of perfectly solid outlines, the outlines have a sort of stencil and brushstroke look to them. But notice how the new one somehow seems bolder and sketchier at the same time. Part of this is because of the increased detail in Bellamy's line work. As a result, Bellamy draws more of your attention and you kinda get more of a feeling of the punch's impact. So part of this change is certainly the line work, but I guess it's more just an overall increase in detail. A great example of this is again, the Luffy and Katakuri fight. If you turn to chapter 895, you can see panels like this where the line work seems thinner and less defined, but each one is loaded with detail. As a result, Katakuri seems a lot more shaded than you would ever see pre-time skip. There's obviously more detail that's used to emphasize each of Katakuri's muscles, and as a result, these panels feel incredibly emotional and expressive. But now that we've been talking about characters for a while, one last thing I'd like to mention before we move on is the character designs. So, to be clear, it's not like character designs have changed drastically after the time skip. But remember how I said Oda had this long evolution of balancing stylization and realism? So in the very beginning, it was completely stylized with no realism. Then around Skypiea, we got what I believed was the peak of character designs with characters like Wiper, who were like all chest and abs, and the proportions look ridiculous, but the characters are full of personality. But once you get to like Enies Lobby and onward, Oda kinda tones this down a bit, making the characters more balanced. And this lasts for hundreds of chapters. That is, until recently. So you take the increase in detail, and somehow now the characters look more cartoonish and more realistic than ever before. You can see it in how characters like Zoro have muscles that look much fuller, even though the proportions are kinda crazy. You can also see it in a lot of the drawings with Nami, who is practically the face of One Piece's goofy proportions allegations. It's funny because now she has the crazy proportions of the Skypiea era, and yet because Oda puts more emphasis into the smaller details as well as the range of colors, she looks more realistic than ever before. So I'm actually kinda torn when it comes to character designs. I wouldn't say they're objectively the best One Piece has ever looked, but it's definitely much better than the Paramount War era. Part of me likes the 2000s look of Skypiea, but part of me respects the hell out of Oda for somehow balancing stylization and realism in a way he's never done before, and making One Piece look the most unique it has ever looked. But now that I've done my fair share of arguing in favor of the new art style, it's about time I explain what I don't like about it. Now, I mentioned what I do like about the line work and details, but what I don't like about the line work, and again, this isn't just line work, but it's part of it. But what I don't like is how One Piece is consistently messier. So if we go back to that same Katakuri chapter, here we have the reveal of Gear 5th. It looks perfectly fine until you look at Luffy's feet. His feet look like they were drawn in a rush, and specifically his toes look more like doodles and less like real toes. Ignoring that, the rest of the panel looks fine. So to that point you might say, well, it's only a small detail and it's easy to overlook. Except that this kind of thing happens all the time. For example, if you skip to the very end of the same chapter, look at Katakuri's hand right there. The fingers are all out of whack and it barely resembles a real hand. And in case you think this might have only been in Whole Cake, let's skip ahead to Elbaf. In chapter 1130, you have this panel of Goldberg where his thumb is literally just a messy oval with a little doodle to resemble a fingernail. And you have this panel of Luffy where his hand looks like a complete mess. So on the one hand, I love the new sense of realism in One Piece, but it's also really hard to fully appreciate the realism when half the time the characters look like Doodlebob. It makes One Piece feel unpolished, and I often find myself being taken out of the story because of how many times I notice common mistakes like these. Now, the other thing I don't like, and this is my biggest problem with One Piece art, is the paneling. So, to be fair, this is not unique to One Piece. You can see the exact same thing in other big manga like Naruto. But One Piece is probably the worst offender because not only does it have this bland paneling, but it's also a complete mess. This has been a problem since the Paramount War, where you get some pretty cursed paneling. And it's examples like these that show it's not so much the paneling alone as it is a combination of paneling and sequencing. Because oftentimes in big fights, the paneling is perfectly fine. But again, examples like these in Marineford show exactly how messy the paneling can look. And a big part of that is because the further into One Piece you get, the less Oda pushes the boundaries with sequencing. The choreography is perfectly fine. In fact, in some cases, it's some of the best in manga. But as far as the transition from one panel to another and the boundaries between those panels, that's what is a real turnoff. The worst example is whenever you get moments like Marineford where a bunch of stuff is going on. There's a good amount in Whole Cake, and there's a ton of it in Wano, particularly on Onigashima when there was a ton going on. And to this you might say, well, give Oda some credit, he has to draw all of these different scenes all at once. But remember, Kishimoto had the same thing going on in his final arc of Naruto, and the paneling there is perfectly clean. A bit bland, sure, but much cleaner than any of these examples from One Piece. So this, coupled with the goofy mistakes you often come across, is why I often find myself reminiscing about the older days of One Piece. Which brings us to the big question from before. Namely, has One Piece gotten worse, or has it gotten better? And my answer to that isn't so simple. First off, as much as I hate the paneling in recent chapters, this isn't a new problem. This kind of paneling goes all the way back to Skypiea, and I already admitted that's when I think the art style peaked. So I can't really mark One Piece for that one. But I used to think One Piece peaked back then. Now I'm not so sure. So if you ask me what I think is the perfect era of art in One Piece, I think it comes down to Skypiea versus the stuff we're getting right now. Between those two, it kind of comes down to preference. If you prefer the 2000s style of manga like say Soul Eater or especially Shaman King, then you probably prefer that Skypiea era. But I bring up Shaman King because out of all of those 2000s style manga, I think Shaman King does that look the most justice. One Piece is definitely up there, but whereas One Piece is somewhat more balanced even in Skypiea, Shaman King is completely exaggerated and as a result has somewhat more personality in that style. The newer One Piece art lets go of trying to stick to that era of art and really finds its own style thanks to the incredible balance of realism and stylization. Plus, while I might love the 2000s style, One Piece has never looked as colorful as it does right now. That being said, I'm also not in love with how inconsistent the manga can look. It's not uncommon to find these weird amalgamations that Oda calls hands, and the older stuff looks much cleaner by comparison. Which is why I say it depends. If you prefer the consistency and 2000s style of Skypiea, that's great, and I'm right there with you. But I also find myself in the camp of loving the current art style, because its bright and diverse color scheme makes it so fun to look at, and its balance of finer detail and silly character designs give One Piece a sense of personality that it's never quite had. So, do I completely prefer the older stuff over the new stuff? Not really. But would I say the art has gotten worse? Absolutely not. While the paneling and silly mistakes are blatantly poor reflections on One Piece, I also think the art that's coming out of the manga is some of the best Oda has ever made, and between the insane fights and gorgeous color spreads, I find myself loving the new art just as much as the classic art. It's precisely because of this that I will always praise the current art style of One Piece. But now I'd like to hear what you think. How would you rate the new art style of One Piece? How does it compare to other manga? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like to join me for another discussion like this one, then make sure to check out my live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. In those live streams, I react to new chapters as well as discuss other anime and manga topics. Also, make sure to check out my other One Piece videos in the One Piece playlist, which you can find linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.